This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Again, it's my honor to introduce this fabulous panel. The session is James Baldwin's Uneasy Alliances. First, I'm going to begin by introducing Professor Charles Nero. He received his PhD from Indiana University. Currently, he is Professor of Rhetoric, African American Studies, and American Cultural Studies at Bates College, where he teaches courses in film and literature. A pioneer in African American queer studies, his 1991 essay, Toward a Black Gay Aesthetic, Signifying in Contemporary Black Gay Literature, was the first essay to provide a systematic critical framework for the analysis of Black gay texts. His essays on film, literature, and queer studies have appeared in the academic journals Camera Obscura, Feminist Media Studies, Public Cultural, Forecast, a Journal of African Diaspora Studies, Callaloo, a Journal of African American Diaspora Arts and Letters, the Howard Journal of Communication, and the Journal of the History of Sexuality, and in the anthologies Brother to Brother, New Writings by Black Gay Men, Black Queer Studies in the Millennium, Out in the South, Queer Representations, Reading Lives, Reading Cultures, the Center of the Lesbian Gay Studies Reader, Our Voices, and many others. I also want to introduce Marlon Moore, Professor Marlon Moore. Professor Moore is the author of the forthcoming book, In the Life and in the Spirit, Homoerotic Spirituality and African American Literature. Her research includes applause, LGBT, African American fiction, gender studies, representations of Black lesbians in film, and Southern culture studies. Her work is featured in African American Review and Black Camera, as well as recent and upcoming anthologies and critical essays. So we're going to begin with Professor Nero, and then we're going to go with Professor Moore. So without further ado.
So, James Baldwin's and Federico Garcia Lorca's faggots. Well, there we have it. The modern LGBTQ movement claims Baldwin and Lorca as pioneers and forefathers. Indeed, they are, since they were some of the most important writers to pen works about homoerotic desire and love. However, Baldwin's and Lorca's models of masculinity can be profoundly at odds with the LGBTQ movement. Both writers share a similar approach to representing male homosexuality when they distinguish between manly men and shameful males whose very essence debases masculinity. Thus, one finds the most homophobic sentiments alongside rhapsodic depictions of same-sex desire among males. How do we explain this seeming contradiction? As a professor who teaches courses in literature, I often wonder, how do I teach about the LGBTQ community as an inclusive one when I encounter homophobic invective in a text that celebrates same-gender desire? Often I am challenged to get students to discuss why this intense hatred of some types of queer people. I am acutely aware, attentive to the fact that Baldwin and Lorca's models of masculine homosexuality can be profoundly challenging for a modern LGBT rights movement. Yet it is important to remember that throughout much of the 20th century, the apparatus of power in society punished homosexuals. The state criminalized and routinely imprisoned us. Medicine defined us as mentally defective. Religious organizations relegated us to demonic status, and families often turned us into outcasts. Defending same-gender desire was literally finding one's way out of a labyrinth. The art that Baldwin and Lorca created was burdened by apologias for same-gender desire. To a great degree, Baldwin and Lorca's defenses of homosexuality had to accommodate to the homophobia of 20th century culture. I use an archaeological approach to the representation of homosexual males in order to understand the homophobic invective present in an earlier generation of writers, particularly Lorca's and Baldwin's. I conclude this presentation by drawing attention to Revolutionary Hope, a conversation between Baldwin and Audre Lorde that first appeared in Essence magazine in December of 1984. Baldwin's homophobia. The faggot is a recurring figure in Baldwin's works, and I believe that Baldwin truly needed this figure. For Baldwin, the faggot served two seemingly contradictory purposes. It legitimated love between masculine males while serving simultaneously as a ritual of insult. We see these two purposes at play in Giovanni's Room, then in Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, and in some of Baldwin's essays. Giovanni's Room is a pioneering work of fiction because of the centrality of the doomed love story between the white American David and the Italian Giovanni. Although the love story is central, there are moments in which David uses homophobia to describe the males in the queer bars he frequents. David calls them les folles, French for the birds, and he makes it evident that he despises them. There were, he states, see that? All in a long quote, and we can read it there. Always dressed in the most improbable combinations, screaming like parrots the details of their latest love affairs. Their love affairs always seemed to be hilarious. Occasionally one would swoop in quite late in the evening to convey the news that he, but they always called each other she, had just spent time with the celebrated movie star or boxer. Then all the others closed in on this newcomer, and they looked like a peacock garden and sounded like a barnyard. I found it difficult to believe that they ever went to bed with anybody, for a man who wanted a real woman would certainly have rather had a real one, and a man who wanted a man would certainly not want one of them. David heightens his disgust for these males when he adds an evolutionary spin to his invective, drawing parallels between apes and les folles. David recalls, there was a boy who worked all day, it was said in the post office, who came out at night wearing makeup and earrings with his heavy blonde hair piled high. People said that he was very nice, but I confess that his utter grotesqueness made me uneasy, perhaps in the same way that the sight of monkeys eating their own excrement turns some people's stomachs. They might not mind so much if the monkeys did not resemble so grotesquely human beings. Baldwin's homophobic invective took on racial dimensions in the 1960s and 1970s, when faggots became the term applied almost exclusively to whites. In the novel Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, the actor Leo Proudhammer recalls New York's Greenwich Village, not as a mecca for bohemians, but as a site for privileged, doomed white perverts and faggots, such as, he states, the faggot painter and his lesbian wife, who had an understanding with each other which made them brutally cruel to all their playmates, and which welded them hatefully to each other. The lost, lonely man who worked the shipyards and lived with his mother, who loved young boys and feared them and who jumped off a roof. The nice middle-aged couple everyone was always glad to see, the husband of which couple, weeping and sweating, once threw me down among the garbage cans and tried to blow me. Don't tell Marcia. Please don't tell my wife. The brilliant Boston Skyan who liked to get fucked in the ass and threw himself before a subway train, which chopped off his head. These males are devoid of any love, and they are tragic. In Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, Baldwin furthered the identification of the faggot by associating it with the Southern male. One of the most chilling moments in the novel occurs when Leo's brother Caleb recalls the torment from a guard during the time he spent in the Southern jail. Caleb describes when the Irish guard rode up on a horse and told him, "Nigger, if my balls was on your chin, where would my prick be?" When Caleb frightened the horse, almost causing the guard to fall from it, the guard retreated, only returned with a bevy of white guards. They tortured Caleb to the point that he confessed to them, "I ain't worth shit." This scenario of a collective group of Southern white males torturing a solitary black male victim became a motif in Baldwin's work. The critic Trudia Harris commented about this motif that for Baldwin, the South was a monstrous place, populated by faggots, a cowardly pack who seek their manhood and their courage in numbers. Indeed, In the long essay, No Name in the Streets, Baldwin commented, "It began to seem to me, indeed, not entirely frivolously, that the only thing which prevented the South from being an absolutely homosexual community was precisely the reverberating absence of men." How do we explain Baldwin's homophobia? I think that it is useful to examine the homophobic invective in Baldwin's work by locating it in a tradition of gay male writing that dates back to the late 18th century. In The Seduction of the Mediterranean, Robert Eldridge demonstrates that the image of a homoerotic Mediterranean, both classical and modern, became the major motif in the writing and the art of homosexual European men from the time of the Enlightenment until the 1950s. These writers found lots of examples of same-gender relationships in these ancient texts. One thing that I would like to explore and to build upon that Eldridge does not discuss in The Seduction of the Mediterranean is the model of masculinity in which same-gender relations among males occurs. Now, there are two cultural images of manhood that existed in classical Greece. Positively in the figure of the hoplite warrior, the citizen soldier wealthy enough to provide himself with a set of armor, and negatively in the Knados. The image of the Knados was of a man socially deviant in his entire being, whose deviance was principally observable in behavior that flagrantly violated or contravened the dominant social definition of masculinity. Not all males who engaged in sex with other males were actually called Knados because, to some degree, homosexual relations between males had some measure of social legitimacy. However, sex was the defining characteristic of the Knados. In Rome, Maud Gleason notes, the word Knados describes sexual deviance in its most specific sense, referring to males who prefer to play a feminine, that is, receptive role in intercourse with other men. Why did the Knados matter? Scholars argue that its most important function was as an insult. The rhetorical force of this insult was either to rob another man of the power to speak in public debate or to nullify his political leadership. Amy Riesland points out, in societies in which public reputation played such a large part, an officially bad reputation was no joke. Lorca's Ode to Walt Whitman appeared in the privately published collection Poet in New York. Lorca, who was assassinated by the fascist victors of the Spanish Civil War, wrote the collection following his extended stay in New York while studying at Columbia University. I consider Lorca's collection an important touchstone or moment of contact for the Harlem Renaissance. Lorca spent time in Harlem and met with African-American writers such as Countee Cullen and Nella Larson. In fact, the collection contains a long poem about Lorca, about Harlem. Lorca's poem, Ode to Walt Whitman, can be seen as a defense of Whitman from the image of the modern-day Knados, that is, the effeminate male. Lorca defends Walt Whitman, calling him the lovely old man, while denouncing the men gathered at bars, emerging in bunches from the sewers, trembling between the legs of chauffeurs, or spinning on dance floors wet with absinthe, who point at Whitman and claim, "He's one too." These effeminate, unmanly males give boys drops of foul death with bitter poison, Lorca wrote. Lorca goes on to name them in an infamous rant that begins in the U.S. and proceeds to span the geography of the Spanish-speaking world. These men are the fairies of North America, pájaros of Havana, jotos of Mexico, zarazas de Cádiz, cancos de Madrid, floras de Alicante, adelares of Portugal. They are, Lorca continues, faggots of the world, murderers of doves, slaves of women, their bedroom bitches. Lorca makes it clear that he is not denouncing homosexuality, but unmanliness when he espouses tolerance for a variety of males. He writes, that's why, in the poem, that's why I don't raise my voice, old Walt Whitman, against the little boy who writes in the name of a girl on his pillow, nor against the boy who dresses as a bride in the darkness of the wardrobe, nor against the solitary men in casinos who drink prostitution's water with revulsion, nor against the men with the green look in their eyes, who love other men and burn their lips in silence. Lorca is delineating between two types of masculinity, I believe, and I believe their origins are in the classical world. Lorca would have known about these types of masculinity in the ancient world because he was educated in the classics. Like Lorca, Baldwin was acutely aware of the classics. He's fond of saying that he received his education in the New York Public Library, where he read everything he could get his hands on. And while few scholars have had access to Baldwin's papers, there is ample evidence that he was familiar with the Mediterranean as well as this dichotomy of masculinity I have described so far. Giovanni's room bears the stamp of the Mediterranean. Although the setting of the novels is in Paris, David narrates the entire novel from a house on the south of France near the Mediterranean. David's lover is Mediterranean because he is Italian. There's also the allusion to the biblical characters David and Giovanni, that is David and Jonathan, which evoke the ancient Mediterranean world of Judea. And of course, there are many other allusions, such as allusions to Ovid and Ovid's metamorphosis in Giovanni's room. It is not surprising, then, that Baldwin would invoke the image of the Knados in his defense of himself, against Cleaver's famous attack on him in Soul on Ice. Cleaver called homosexuality a racial death wish and said that Baldwin and other Negro homosexuals acquiescing in this racial death wish are outraged and frustrated because in their sickness they are unable to have a baby by a white man. The cross they have to bear is that already bending over and touching their toes for the white man, the fruit of their miscegenation is not the little half-white offspring of their dreams, but an increase in the unwinding of their nerves, though they redouble their efforts and intake of the white man's sperm. Baldwin's response to Cleaver's attack was not a denunciation of homophobia, of Cleaver's homophobia, nor was it a denial that he had had relationships with males. As many noted, Baldwin was always clear that he had had relationships with men and women. Instead, Baldwin evoked the figure of the Knados. In No Name in the Street, Baldwin wrote that he believed that Cleaver confused him in his mind with the unutterable debasement of the male, with all those faggots, punks, and sissies, the sight of and sound of whom in prison must have made him vomit more than once. Baldwin understood himself much like men in the ancient Mediterranean world, when an assault was made against their masculine integrity in the public sphere. To repeat Amy Richland's observation that in societies in which public reputation played such a large part, an officially bad reputation was no joke. For Baldwin, then, the issue was that he had no kinship with faggots, punks, and sissies. Rather, he was a man, although he was one who had sex with men. Baldwin and Lord. Now, in December of 1983, Gloria Joseph orchestrated a conversation between James Baldwin and Audre Lorde at Hampshire College. The conversation lasted over 5 hours, and an excerpt of it was published in Essence magazine the following December. The conversation is striking for how deeply invested in patriarchy Baldwin was. For instance, at one point, a clearly frustrated Baldwin asked Lorde, "Don't you realize that in this republic, the only real crime is to be a black man?" A stunned Audre Lorde replied, "No, I don't realize that. I realize the only crime is to be black, and that includes me too." This exchange clearly points to how Baldwin understood masculinity. And I'll conclude real quickly. The stakes were high. Baldwin said, "A black man has a prick, they hack it off. A black man is a nigger when he tries to be a model for his children and he tries to protect his women. The principal crime in this republic is being a black man, and every black man knows it, and every black woman pays for it." In conclusion, I'll just point out that shortly after Baldwin's death in 1987, Barbara Smith, Joseph Beam, and Cheryl Clark wrote moving tributes to James Baldwin that appeared initially in Boston's Gay Community News and were republished in Blackout, the national magazine of the Coalition for Black Lesbians and Gays. What prompted their memorials was the silence about Baldwin's homosexuality and the orations given at his funeral, notably by Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, and Amiri Baraka. Smith, ever astute, pointed to the central problem in Baldwin's creative life. Although Baldwin was always frank about his homosexuality, he was never politicized about it, which means that he did not challenge directly the pantheon of African American writers and intellectuals to understand homosexuality and homophobia as significant political concerns. I agree with Smith. Throughout most of his creative work, Baldwin reproduced some of the most offensive images associated with homosexuality. His motif of the faggot is harmful and a challenge to the idea of a beloved community. I conclude this essay by pointing out that Baldwin was not alone in his view of masculine imagery. He was part of a long tradition of queer men who had to figure out how to represent their desires for same-gender love in a world of intense state-led persecution. Baldwin's importance as a writer of same-gender desire cannot be discounted. As Joseph Beam wrote about discovering Giovanni's room, I read it and I realized that the experiences reflected what I felt. I lay there among those sweaty, tangled sheets with them. I knew even at 11 that it was boys and men to whom I was sexually attracted, but didn't quite understand what that meant. But those feelings of both terror and anticipation informed the earliest of my childhood friendships. As we struggle in this conference with the question of whose beloved community, Baldwin points out the need to question and challenge an image of masculinity that requires us to throw one type of man to the curb to redeem the race. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for coming. So I feel like I must apologize a little bit because there's going to be a bit of overlap with Charles's paper. I was a bit afraid of that, but so what it means then is I'm going to have to cut out, some stuff, and because we use a lot of the, not a lot, but a couple of the same citations. So, but we're asking similar questions, but taking them, I think, in different directions. So the title of my paper is The Homophile Movement, James Baldwin and Giovanni's Room. When literary scholars and critics talk about the shifts in the cultural politics of Baldwin's fiction, his work is usually split into two dimensions, before 1968 and after. Specifically, scholars have identified the shift from his civil rights-inflected interracial fiction and drama in works like Another Country and The Amen Corner to an engagement with the Black Power perspective in Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone and If Beale Street Could Talk, and others. A somewhat different but related concern that also emerged in the discourse is how, for all of his willingness to be a witness for oppressed people, Baldwin resisted being seen as a representative of the gay rights movement, even though the movement's historians situate his 1956 publication of Giovanni's Room as one of the watershed moments in LGBT literature. For example, one can find quotes dating back to 1965 when Baldwin explained that, quote, homosexual, bisexual, and heterosexual are 20th century terms which have very little meaning, end quote. This particular choice of words is reminiscent of his critique of the social construction of race, which he called examining the assumptions behind the words. And more importantly to me, they presage Foucault's ideas on the history of sexuality by 10 years. The ideas that are embraced in queer studies about the power of discourse and how our subjectivity is defined by and therefore controlled by the cultural norms and the power structures that maintain those norms. So when Baldwin refuses to know what heterosexual or homosexual means, he is refusing to give power to the state or to be controlled by a desire to become normative. Those proto-queer analytics are functional in intellectual or academic circles, but it must have been very troubling to hear him say in 1969 that public expressions of same-sex desire were, quote, exhibitions of disaster, end quote. And that he was still resisting 20 years later in the context of the 1980s that Charles was just talking about, when folks of all stripes were drowning in the trickled-down nothingness of Reaganomic indifference and the deluge of death brought on by AIDS, which required a tenacious and vibrant response from activists with broad platforms, many of whom considered it politically imperative to embrace visibility politics and a gay or lesbian identity as a demonstration of solidarity. It was 1984, the same year that the film Before Stonewall was released, insisting that it had documented the making of a gay and lesbian community, and 2 years after Cheryl Clark proclaimed that she names herself lesbian on purpose in resistance to predatory institutionalized heterosexuality. I am referring to the now infamous interview in the Village Voice titled Go the Way Your Blood Beats, when at age 60, he said, "The word gay has always rubbed me the wrong way. I never understood exactly what was meant by it. I don't mean to sound distant or patronizing," he continues. "I simply feel it's a world that has very little to do with me and with where I grew up." The conventional wisdom in literary studies seems to be that by 1970 there was a split between Baldwin, the respectable essayist and public speaker, and Baldwin, the pro-sex, pro-erotic, dicks all up in ya novelist. that he had been so painfully we let that that he had been so painfully scapegoated for his literary and real-life cross-racial desires, as well as for his effeminate mannerisms, that he had been so roundly rejected by the Black arts generation as an ineffective, anachronistic leftover from the previous civil rights era, that when he spoke directly to an audience, he always chose to represent racial concerns over sexual ones. The exceptions to this are his discussions of the nuclear Black family, or America's obsession with the Black phallus and its incongruous Puritan ethic. In other words, when he spoke of the needs of the Black man, he did so as a normative patriarchal provider who needed to protect his women, his sisters, and children, and not one who may also desire protection from anti-gay violence perpetuated by the state and everyday folks in the street. In regard to his uneasy alliance with the gay liberation movement, scholars such as Marlon Ross, Dwight McBride, and Robert Reed Farr, and also indirectly, I think, the recent work of Jeffrey McCune and C. Riley Snorton, address Baldwin's stance because they speak to questions of cultural belonging and the ways Black people negotiate stigmatized sexuality and gender expressions. The constraints of this conference paper format will not allow me to make a smooth transition here. But what I want to say is that when I sift through all of this scholarship, I study it as someone who is interested in mapping the tradition of neutral or affirming depictions of homoeroticism in African American literature. I am also interested in how or if these depictions engage the political landscapes from which they emerge. So when I read these discussions of how Baldwin's political rhetoric shifted over time from a civil rights integrationist endeavor to a Black power self-reliant perspective, but that his ideas around gay liberation never budged, I had to wonder if we've missed an influential political period in his life, because some of his positions are reminiscent, at least for me, of the homophile discourse. I am not suggesting that one should go to the library at Yale, where Baldwin's papers are held, in order to search for proof, right, of a subscription to a magazine, as was the case with Lorraine Hansberry. But rather, I am asserting that if we who study LGBT literature are going to talk about Baldwin's identification or lack thereof with mainstream political movements, that we should also consider that the homophile movement may have also influenced African American writers. The homophile movement was, as you all probably know, dedicated to decriminalizing and destigmatizing homosexuality through education and the production of what we now call queer-affirming media. And it experienced a surge of international activism between 1948 and 1960. In the 60s decade, and I guess this could be dated to this post-Stonewall, right at Stonewall, there was a changing of the guard due to the internal turbulence in the men's organizations. The central conflict was about the role and nature of visibility politics, which I will discuss soon. The younger homophiles renamed themselves and the publications gay, and as the founding leadership faded into the background, the new visibility politics were represented by slogans such as out of the closets and into the streets and gay pride. But this stance was never representative of all the people who wanted to make society more sexually inclusive. The rest of this paper works toward the argument that we can locate similar tensions in Giovanni's Room when we read it alongside the social history scholarship on homophile organizations. Implicitly, this could lead to another way of interpreting his nonfiction and statements made in interviews. The two contexts that are most relevant to this discussion are New York and Paris. Because Baldwin was a transatlantic commuter whose life and perceptions were informed by these two locales the most between 1941 and 48 when he lived in Greenwich Village, and from 48 to 1960, the first segment of his France years. The scholarship on the homophile movement in Paris and New York revealed three similar overarching themes. First, the publications reflect a middle to upper class and white male assimilationist respectability ethos. Second, their rhetoric around homosexual visibility privileged assimilationist, respectable, masculine expressions. And third, while they believed homosexuality between consenting adults could eventually become a non-issue by educating the public and changing the laws, the majority of the editorials and letters in homophile publications revealed deep resentment for the visibility of effeminate men, a segment of the population that was most identified with working class masculinity and street life. And this is the working class masculinity that is separate from the leather sort of muscle men, right? So that's another class division. The visibility of effeminate men, commonly referred to as swishes at this time, and the spectacle of drag queens were considered an impediment to acceptance and were therefore rhetorically cordoned off from those who deserve protection and inclusion. And they were collectively blamed for the increasingly hostile response from the government and law enforcement during the post-war period. George Sedaris is the author of the essay titled Fola, Swells, Effeminates, and Homophiles in Saint-Germain-des-Prés of the 1950s. In his study of urban gay history in France, Sedaris situates the Saint-Germain quarter of Paris as the command post of a male homosexual culture that was in its heyday during the years Baldwin resided there, again in that 48 to 60 period. It received much attention from the homophile and mainstream press because of this. It is also the setting for Guillaume's bar in Giovanni's Room. According to Sedaris, although Saint-Germain was by no means the only site of visible gay culture in Paris, it had a special place in the homosexual geography and sociability of the period because it offered the daily spectacle of a free and homosexual life, where different styles of homosexuality rubbed shoulders. The quarter was famous above all for its foal, and this is spelled F-O-L-L-E-S. It's a French word that Charles pronounced perfectly. The quarter was, I appreciate that. The quarter was famous above all for its foe, who were not specific to it, but who stood out by their effeminate mannerisms, their swishing walk, their elegant clothes, sometimes their facial makeup, and especially their mannered way of speaking, often punctuated with piercing shrieks, which distinguished them from the other homosexuals. This level of visibility had been the status quo before World War II, and the homophile press made no commentary about it. The conflict that emerged in homophile discourse in the 1950s was in direct response to the larger panic of masculinity that took place during the Cold War. The French homophile magazines complained that the tourists in search of trysts, the sex workers who obliged them, and the mere presence of the drag queens that made Saint-Germain so popular also perpetuated the problem of negative visibility because the French government eventually made no distinction between public homosexual behavior, public drunkenness, and alleyway or bathroom sex work. To combat these perceptions, homophile journals sought to educate its readers regarding positive scientific and medical advancements, including excerpts from the 1948 Kinsey Report. They also, as Sedaris explains it, constructed the homophile man as a man who happened to love men, but who was otherwise like anyone else. To do this, they advocated for the figure of the virile man as the ideal representative of manhood. Sexual discretion would permit the homophile to integrate into the wider society. The American homophile publications were not so different. Craig Lofton explored the archives in Los Angeles and found that when the Mattachine Society and Daughters of Bilitis coordinated their civil rights agenda, a vociferous anti-swish contingency emerged and created a schism between the middle class and working class membership. And of course, I'm conflating these time periods. There's maybe a 7 to 8 year difference between the establishment of the men's organizations and the women. And in the women's cases, right, the argument was against sort of butch visibility, right? So there's a similar parallel. Like the Parisian homophiles, the American organizations were not advocating invisibility, but were trying to change the dominant narrative by changing the iconic image of the homosexual minority. The Americans worried that swishes monopolized their visibility because, quote, heterosexuals saw only swishes as homosexual and thus believed that all homosexuals were swishes, end quote. And some even blamed the victims of violence for making themselves targets. They modeled their visibility politics on the black civil rights strategy of trying to replace degrading stereotypes with affirming ones as a way to change people's beliefs about black people. The homophile literature appropriates this strategy overtly by comparing the swish to the Sambo and Coon caricatures in popular culture. Lofton writes that they wanted to look like dignified citizens who were entitled to their rights and protections and benefits of American citizenship. To them, swishing flew in the face of this effort. Eventually, the Parisian and American movements experienced backlash and pushback from the queens, sissies, and self-identified faggots who would critique the anti-swish bias and facilitate the changes I discussed earlier in terms of the move to gay. Okay, I just said that. So I'm going to at this point is when I go back to Giovanni's room and use the same quote from Guillaume's bar that Charles referenced. And I'll just add that the point of the scene is not to have the reader identify with David's condescension and repulsion, but to further reveal David's pattern for fervently denying that his experiences with same-sex desire have any connection to the other people in the bar. This denial of his feelings, his unwillingness to own the truth of his body, is the unforgivable sin that he commits against himself, his girlfriend, and Giovanni. This is why the description of the employee is followed by the admission that, quote, folks might not mind so much if monkeys did not so grotesquely resemble human beings, end quote. David disdains all male femininity, and that disdain blends with pity when his attention is directed toward the two rich older queens, Guillaume and Jacques. In contrast, all of David's sexual experiences were with masculine men, from his first teenage encounter to the summer romance with Giovanni, and including the muscular sailors he flirted with when he was drunk. He takes no pride in this behavior, but he does believe it to be less grotesque than the others he describes so disrespectfully. It has been long established that Giovanni's room is not about coming to terms with a gay or bisexual identity, and I'm speaking in terms of LGBT studies in literature. This is how I think it's talked about. It is an indictment of a Western culture that denies men their full humanity by denying them access to the possibility of erotic autonomy, sexual honesty, and the shedding of what Baldwin calls our illusions. At the same time, its conservative views on masculinity and the protagonist's attitude toward what was considered negative visibility in the post-war period mirror the major tensions in a homophilic discourse about the best ways to affect change. I'm wondering if there is a way to talk about the concurrence of the homophile perspective and the gay liberation consciousness instead of assuming that one period ends and another cleanly begins. This paper is but a sketch of some of my ideas, but I do hope to continue this line of questioning regarding the black homophile figure or the possibility of a period of black homophile literature. This approach could change the way we talk about historical periods in African American literature and maybe add a new dimension to our critical study of the early to mid 20th century authors. We are already having to reconsider Lorraine Hansberry's art in light of her recently revealed lesbian relationships and dialogue with readers of the homophile literature via letters to the editor. Surely she's not the only one. I look forward to any feedback you have on these ideas. Thank you.
All right, a round of applause.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.